Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dharma and Justice Dialogue series from the Thich Nhat Hanh Program for Engaged Buddhism. My name is Peace Twessiji, and I am the Assistant Director for the Thich Nhat Hanh Program, as well as Buddhism and Interreligious Engagement, where students are studying and pursuing graduate degrees here within Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Today's conversation is on Dharma and Abolition. And for the first time in this series, Union students will be leading the dialogue. So Wei-Shin Wang and Greg Smith will be in conversation with Dr. Jasmine Syedullah, Dr. Rima Vesely-Flad, and Lama Justin van Bujdoss. The conversation today will explore this. With nearly 2.3 million people locked up behind bars, the United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. Moreover, Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color are disproportionately targeted for criminalization and incarceration. With the Bodhisattva vow calling for the liberation of all beings, how should American Buddhists contend with the present reality of mass incarceration and its origins in the 13th Amendment? Are Buddhist notions of liberation aligned with movements to abolish jails and prisons? Are there alternative ways of thinking about the current retributive justice system that are rooted in the Dharma? So this is going to be a very engaging conversation. So in the interest of time, instead of reading a bio for each speaker, I will put a link that includes their bios for you to reference in the chat after I'm done speaking. And now, just before I hand things over to Wei-Shin and Greg, I would like to say a quick thank you to the communications team who's brought this event to reality and support, and also the ASL interpreters here tonight. So thank you. So for all of you here attending, please note that if you're in Zoom, the question and answer box is open, the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to put questions in that come up during the conversation, that happen during the conversation in the Q&A box, if you would like a response. Questions easily get lost in the chat. So if you'd like a response from the panelists, make sure you put your question in the Q&A area. And for those of you on Facebook and YouTube, I'll do my best to bring your questions into this Zoom space so the panelists can see your questions so they can respond to them as well. There's time reserved at the end for your questions. So we'll be sure to get to them. So I think that's all for me. So now I'd like to pass the mic to Wei-Shin.
Thank you, Peace, and good evening, everyone. We are grateful that you are joining us for this dynamic conversation with our esteemed guests on Dharma and Abolition. My name is Wei-Shin Wang. I'm a fourth-year graduate student at Union Theological Seminary, pursuing a master's in divinity in Buddhism and interreligious engagement, and also a master's in social work at Columbia University. To begin our gathering today, on behalf of the community here at Union Theological Seminary, we'd like to humbly acknowledge that our institution is sitting on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded stolen traditional homeland of the Lenape people. This island of Mannahatta in Lenape-Hoking has long been a gathering place for Indigenous people to trade and maintain kinship ties. We wish to honor and pay our respects to the Lenape people who, as they endure centuries of settler colonialism, genocide, and displacement, are continuing to contribute to the life of this land and to celebrate their heritage, practice, traditions, care for the sacred homeland and waterways, and generously share with us ways to be in right relationship with the earth and one another. If you are not familiar with or connected to this community, we invite you to learn more about and support the Lenape people and other indigenous communities whose land you are residing on. We also acknowledge the legacy of slavery here in New York City, where the enslaved African people were exploited for countless generations. For more than 2 centuries, New York was the capital of American slavery. African slaves were regularly bought and sold here, and the ships used in the slave trade built New York's economy. Later, New York also became a center for the efforts to abolish slavery, as well as a thriving nexus of Black culture and community. We honor and pay respect to all the enslaved Africans and their descendants for not only the struggle and resilience against slavery, against Jim Crow segregation, and against the ongoing anti-Black racism plaguing this nation, but also the immeasurable contributions to all aspects of life, certainly here in our neighborhood of Harlem and throughout New York City, the United States, and all over the world. It goes without saying that today's conversation on Dharma, justice, and abolition would not be possible without this legacy. We hope you will join us to continue to learn and support the movement for Black liberation. Now, I wish to invite my fellow co-facilitator, Greg Smith, to share a few words.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Greg Smith. I'm a union student. I'm excited to be here with you all. A month and a day ago, our beloved Thich Nhat Hanh passed away. And many of us here, and no doubt around the globe, are deeply impacted by Thay's passing and by the way he embodied the Dharma. As a union alumnus and devout peace activist, Union honored Thay by naming our program after him. Reverend Kosin Gregory Snyder, the Senior Director of Buddhist Studies here at Union, had this to say about Thay, quote, "His teaching has always been a refusal to harden around division, an effort to bring together all sides into dialogue, to recognize the Buddha nature of all without exception, and harmonize mind, heart, community, and earth in an effort to transform human society into a compassionate and loving reality for all beings," end quote. Before we begin with our conversation tonight, we'd like to take a moment to pay tribute to Thay. So I ask you all to please join me in a moment of silence in honoring him and all he's offered us. Thank you. And now I'd like to pass it over to Wei-Shing.
Thank you, Greg. Before we invite our honored guests to join us, I would just like to briefly share my location and context relative to the subject of Dharma and abolition. My family and my immigration story are rooted in state violence. When my family lived in China, my grandfather was repeatedly persecuted and incarcerated for his political affiliation. As a result, my family eventually immigrated to the United States in pursuit of something we thought was more akin to freedom and opportunity, like so many immigrants have done and continue to do. However, in the last decade or so, I became aware of and politicized deeply by the reality of state violence here in the United States, particularly about the current reality of mass incarceration of the 2.3 million people. And as Peace shared, it is the highest incarceration rate in the world, higher than that of Russia, than that of India, and than that of my country of origin, China. It's hard to believe, truly. Indigenous, Black, and Latinx individuals are disproportionately represented amongst the incarcerated population. And I see this reality every week at my internship at the Bronx Defenders, which is a public defense office in New York City. Every week, my colleagues and I work to support Black, Latinx, and other individuals from structurally oppressed communities. Every week, I meet people who are caught in the criminal legal system for being poor, for being traumatized, and for not being able to receive their basic needs like housing and healthcare. It's heartbreaking each and every week. And as a Zen Buddhist practicing the vow of freeing all beings from suffering, it's been very difficult, if not impossible, for me to take my vow seriously and not respond to the violence of mass incarceration. So I am really honored to share this space with everyone here today to dive into and investigate this critical subject of Dharma and abolition. Greg?
Thank you, Wei-Xing. So regarding my location in this conversation, I'll share that I'm approaching it as a white identified Zen practitioner. And before coming to Union, I worked in youth education for 7 years, most specifically as an advocate counselor at the Washington Irving YABC High School here in New York City. I was first introduced to the Dharma by Nancy Mujo Baker in 2014. After studying with her for some years, I received the Bodhisattva precepts in 2019. And at that point, I wanted to deepen Zen practice by integrating my professional and religious commitments. So I began to explore chaplaincy through the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care. Presently, I'm a second year Master of Divinity degree student here at Union and concentrating in Buddhism and interreligious engagement. I became interested in prison Dharma this past year through helping organize the abolitionist student group at Union and participating in the Inside Outside group at the Zen Center for Contemplative Care. I'm serving incarcerated men in my current role as a chaplain intern at Rikers Island as part of a year-long clinical pastoral education program. So at this time, I invite our guests to please come onto the screen so we can begin our conversation. Okay. Lovely, wonderful. So I'd like to begin what in your experience, personally, professionally, academically, and or spiritually, but what inspires you to engage in this work of abolition? What brings you to this work? And perhaps we can start first with Dr. Syedullah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for these questions and for this space and for this panel. These are beloved folks all around. So I'm just so honored to be invited to be part of this conversation. So my journey to this work really started with my freshman year roommate in college, um, in a conversation about social justice, where it became really clear really quickly that I had been indoctrinated into a culture where social justice was something that you just did for its kind of instrumental use in order to get into college. You know, people did soup kitchens and helped out. And I think all of that work is really important. But as a working class, tokenized kid in a private school, I had a lot of misgivings about that work and about people's intentions to do it. And so I was sharing that with my freshman year roommate, and she said, you know, you can do the things that you love and it can still be social justice. It doesn't have to be disingenuous. And that really changed my mind. So I love poetry. And so I got involved with an organization on campus that went inside medium security prisons and conducted poetry workshops with women inside. And that work of storytelling and exchange of just creative expression and workshopping the pieces together really broadened my understanding of what kind of punishment carceral detention really is. Taking mothers away from children, taking children away from mothers, just separating families and creating divisions in society that in other instances are not happening, right? So to be very candid, the kind of things that folks, my students in the prison were being incarcerated for were some of the same things students were doing on the college campus, but because of the privilege that was protecting folks on campus, they could do whatever they liked with impunity for the most part. And that stark juxtaposition of like mobility and choice really woke me up. And being inside that prison at such a young age also just helped me see how alienating the experience of incarceration was, not only for the people inside, but also for the correction officers who were clearly, the ones that I encountered were really drawing a lot of life force from the power that they were gathering from that space. And that power was exacted in violent ways to the women inside and to the visitors, to the volunteers from the outside as well. So it was clear that the targets are indistinguishable at that point. And I was interested in advocating for the prisoners inside in whatever way I could. And of course, the organization that I was working for said that no advocacy is possible once you're inside. We'll compromise our relationship with the warden. And that really started my, this was all happening as I was learning to sit with myself and look at my own propensity to perpetuate harm on myself, which was quite shocking. To be honest, I felt like I lost my best friend when I realized how implicated I was in a system of punishment. And so that journey of just kind of internal interrogation and external witnessing, just bearing witness, opened up a trajectory of inquiry and engagement that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. I think there's a lot of intention behind the invisibility of prisons and policing that we've been sitting with in this country for quite a long time. And I was really appreciative of these spaces to begin to find those loopholes and create connections where typically we don't have to make them.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Dr. Syedullah. It's wonderful to feel your spirit in this space. And I'd like to invite Lama Justin. What brings you to this work?
Yeah, thank you, Greg. So I had actually worked for New York City Department of Correction from mid to late 2016 until just the end of 2021. And prior to that had worked in Rikers as a volunteer leading a meditation group that kind of shifted around. We began first with the female identified population in custody at the Rose M. Singer Center on Rikers, and then I was asked to move into a kind of experimental housing area that was used for people in custody who had assaulted people, had were violent, had violent behavior, and then eventually moving with that young adult male population in a couple of other jail facilities until I started to do a meditation group for staff, which uniformed staff, so correction officers, captains, etc. And then eventually was hired as the first chaplain dedicated to spiritual care for staff, uniformed staff, and then was promoted to executive director for chaplaincy and staff wellness for the agency itself. And so I've seen from the perspective of being a volunteer, learning how to kind of I'm thinking of what Dr. Syedullah just shared about witnessing, because I was there initially to provide meditation group support for people in custody. There was a lot of witnessing, right? Witnessing people walking into the space, providing meditation services, and then a lot of conversation, debriefing, kind of talking about what was that experience like, how do you feel now? And invariably, there was a lot of emotion that would come up about, especially with the women in custody, about their families they were separated from. It was my first real learning about how incarcerated women hold this incredible responsibility of holding their families together while they're incarcerated. So their families, at home, in the community, somehow being asked to look after their kids, from afar, while at the same time navigating everything that's going on with court cases and the uncertainty in the facilities, violence, etc. Maintaining everybody's needs, it's quite dramatic and very difficult. While I was there as a volunteer, we still, for DOC, it was still pretty common that there would be people I would come across who had been held as detainees for up to 5 years, still waiting trial, waiting for resolution for their process, their everything to process through the court system. And that was exceptionally painful to watch, to sit and listen to people's stories as, the kind of logjam, both in the courts and then the complexity of some of the nature of some of the arrests, just was heartbreaking. And then in my employment for the department, I came to see how the complexity of what it means to be a correction officer. The first thing I noticed was the benefits are great, the pension is great. It's an incredible way, on ramp, to a upper middle class livelihood, and all of the stability and security, and what correctional staff are put through to be able to achieve that is inhumane. I mean, under most working kind of environments or situations, these are the kinds of job-related stressors that nobody I know would consent to for their for their salary, for the benefits, for their long-term health. And what I did notice, and I did a lot of research on this while I worked for the department, the impact of PTSD on correctional staff and how that leads to increased violence against people in custody, violence towards oneself, violence towards one's family. Yeah, basically what I ended up learning in a very hard and painful way was just that the system disfigures everybody involved. Both the people, who end up being, they come through the criminal justice system into, in this particular case, New York City Department of Correction, are dehumanized, are hurt, are repeatedly disrespected, and then not treated well through the court system process. But then the staff, in order to survive, have to, generally speaking, respond to stressors that end up being worse than what we find in combat, in the armed forces. And there's a study that came out in the summer of 2019 that basically proved that the PTSD rate amongst correctional staff is higher than active combat veterans from, returning at that time from Afghanistan and related operations. And so nobody is winning. People might think they're winning, they might think they have a great pension. But what I've seen in responding to staff in crisis, visiting them in hospitals, visiting them on their deathbeds, visiting with their loved ones after correctional staff die, is that everybody is touched. The kids of correctional staff are touched by the agency. My own family, I tried my best to engage in the best self-care practices I know, and the stress and heaviness and intensity of the work that I was engaged in impacted me, my physical health, my ability to show up for my kids, my ability to show up for my partner, and I wasn't behind the gate, in that way. So I've learned in a very kind of painful way as a witness that the system is just broken, and that's why I'm here.
Thank you, Lama Justin. Appreciate your perspective. And I'd like to invite Dr. Vesely-Flad, please join us.
Thank you. Thank you for such a personal and evocative telling of what it means to be a parent. And I speak as the parent of young children, and it's causing me to reflect on what I have brought home, truly, in maybe ways that I haven't considered. I'm also thinking of this book, New Jack, which I taught for many years, where a reporter goes into Sing Sing and there's this image of him coming home and looking at his 1-year-old grasping the bars of her crib, and he has this image in his mind of the men with whom he's been. And I can hear the intensity of the cycles that we are committing to, and also that are so deeply embedded then in our cellular structures, just the sense of oppression and also the overwhelm, and really how traumatizing it is. That's what I hear both of you speaking to. And in my own situation, it was actually as a student at Union when I was doing my Master of Divinity degree so many years ago now, that I started to both be inspired, but also come into close contact with the kind of devastation that both of you have named. I was actually first very inspired by a pastor named Reverend Annie Bovian, who showed up at Union and did a workshop. And I heard her talk about working to end the shackling of women who were giving birth while incarcerated. They were being shackled in hospitals, and she had worked on this state legislation and had managed to change that law, working, of course, with legislators and their aides. And I was so inspired by the intensity and capacity that she exuded. So I went to work with her. And so my field internship actually for the MDiv program was working with women in pretrial criminal court. And every week for a year, I went down every Friday afternoon and met with women and recorded their stories and talked with their lawyers and was in close contact in a way that I had never been. And that began a journey that was intellectual and personal. I think every paper I wrote during my MDiv program was on some level about incarceration. And eventually I ended up both starting a nonprofit in New York to work with communities of faith throughout the state on legislative bills and doing grassroots organizing, and then ended up back at Union for a PhD and wrote my dissertation on really the concept of morality and how this is such a clearly moral issue, and how we can, especially those of us who are challenging it, who claim abolition, who claim progressive stances, to really claim that we had ceded ground to more, you could say, conservative or even right-wing politicians. So I was investigating this intellectually, but as I was doing this work, I was teaching at Sing Sing. And I formed these really deep relationships with these men who just were incredibly, incredibly beautiful. And also just in such a hard place. I mean, what they brought to each other and to that space was so intensely painful. And, you know, that trauma that we've all touched upon was something that just stayed with me. There was one semester I taught 2 classes, and I would go home and I would process for 3 days, and then I would go back, and it was like I couldn't ever stop thinking about the conversations, but also how compelled I was to respond. And my way of responding, I would say, was very limited. I think that claiming the language and the framework of abolition is so bold, and the actual practical on the ground work can often feel like hanging a closet door in a house that's burning down. It can feel so limiting. And so I think that's part of what we process also together, is the magnitude of what we are confronting and the devastation, the very human, emotional, practical tearing apart of families, the way that reflects on, even echoes the auction block during slavery. I mean, we are really, in so many ways, we have recreated, we continue to recreate historical patterns that really have devastated Black families for centuries and continue to. And that has been personal, and it's clearly political. And most recently, I have been directing a program at a women's prison, a higher education and prison program. This is working mostly with moms, actually. And so I see it again, these cycles. So in that way, I would say it's personal, it's academic in terms of where it's taken my writing, and it's a journey.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. It's really heartbreaking, and I imagine I'm really moved and touched by all of you sharing, and I feel a sense of kinship in the sense that all of this is personal, and which and feel the dehumanization and the disfiguration and the violence of which not only is affecting the people who are incarcerated, it's affecting the people who are working to incarcerate. It's affecting the people who are working to minimize the harm of those who are incarcerated. It's impacting the families and loved ones of the people who are incarcerated and the people who are working on both sides. And there is a way that, I mean, we can talk about prison incarceration or incarceration as, you know, impacting the individuals who are behind cages, inside cages. And it's pernicious and everywhere and seeps into so many elements of all walks of life. So I really, just in this one conversation, I felt I heard all of you share that and the immensity of that. The suffering is vast and the suffering is long. So speaking of suffering, I'm curious how much your relationship to the Dharma, be it your own practice or studying the Dharma or studying folks who practice and study the Dharma, and how much does that inform your view and work on abolition? And maybe I'll start with Lama Justin and go from there.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a really important question to me. Yeah, it's fascinating. In order, so I come from the Vajrayana tradition, I practice and teach within the Vajrayana tradition, and for me, actually, I relied heavily on Dharma to survive, to be able to keep showing up, and the narrative that we find in Tantric Buddhism around charnel grounds, these places where we all are faced with having to grapple with that which is most painful, scary, usually death and permanence, was the thing that would keep me coming back. A high threshold for pain, so to speak, and so engage in practices involving what it means to maintain equanimity in the face of pain and sadness and loss and brokenness. And I think the big piece for me was just trusting into brokenness and coming to do the work there. I've had a lot of time. It hasn't been a lot of time. I left on December 30th, but I've done a tremendous amount of thinking since then. And I think what the Dharma's ability to heal is where I land now. And wherever I go next, that has to be the big piece, is whether, no matter what tradition you practice, Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, the Dharma has the ability to heal. It has the ability to heal emotionally. It has the ability to heal spiritual fracture, isolation, loneliness, deep personal insult, harm, hurt, everything that we see. It's not easy, and it's not without pain, but that is always there. And so I don't think, this is the irony, right? I don't think the system can be healed, but everybody in the system needs to be healed. And I don't know how to do that. Right? It's going to take a lot of people to come together, and there are people with much, much more wisdom than myself around this. But for me, it is Dharma as a tool to heal and balance and restore and support and nurture. And that is the essence of Dharma. But I think the hard work is getting it in to a system that, I think that's profited from a lot of things, but and I mean no disrespect to my Abrahamic sisters and brothers, but I think the big problem here that we find also in the criminal justice system is this basic problem of binaries: good, bad, right, wrong, left, right, black, white. It's unsustainable. It just that won't work. And so maybe Dharma offers a third way or a different way of revisioning. And I don't even mean revisioning, like, the new jails, close Rikers and build new jails. I mean revisioning, how we as a society and as a people and as a culture look at one another and treat one another and support one another. Because it's clear that we don't now. And it's easy to try to sweep people under the rug, and the thing about Rikers itself that's quite interesting is it's so far away, right? It's this little kind of secretive place that people know about, and of course the people who are incarcerated there, or people in the community whose family members are incarcerated there, are aware of the place. But it's almost as if it profits from secrecy and isolation. And Dharma is also about interconnected being, and so there's a lot in that too. But it is definitely, it has to be a collective effort. Triratna and other style approach.
Thank you, Lama Justin. Dr. Vesely-Flad, I'm curious where you are in this dialectic, if you will.
I think there's a lot that Lama Justin spoke to, and what for me most readily comes to mind, and I'm really thinking of your word practice, is the teaching on causes and conditions and how we practice that teaching. And what has been so formative in my own practice is to think and acknowledge in a very personal way, and also in a very systemic way, how we are conditioned. And what I love about Buddhism is that there is this teaching that allows us to acknowledge conditions and how we are conditioned, our own conditioning. And then there's this really beautiful teaching of the 5 aggregates, this idea that we are in constant flux as human beings. And there's especially this teaching on mental formations, this teaching that actually the root of it in Pali comes from the word karma. And it's the term is sankhara. And in this term sankhara, there's this idea that our suffering, but also our liberation, comes from somewhere. There's a depth to it, but there's also this capacity to work with it and to change. And I think the magnitude of how we are conditioned and the ability, the cultivation of the capacity to turn towards that, it can be so overwhelming. Looking at our systems, looking at, again, the devastation of what has happened to families historically, what is happening right now as we speak on this panel. And in that ability to acknowledge the magnitude of those horrendous conditions, that devastation, then this belief, really, this turning towards our own conditioning and believing within Buddhist teachings and our own practices that we can actually change our conditioning, and we can turn that outward and start to change these social conditions. There's an optimism that I find so important and gratifying, that does come with, I think, deep practice, that allows me to also then look at these students in the prison and believe in who they are, or to look at activists on the ground and their capacity to sustain. It's grueling work year after year, and yet there's this commitment. And so, again, sometimes it can feel futile, and yet I have this sense that with changing our conditioning internally and turning that outward, that we can move forward. I think it's incremental. I don't know that we're going to save the burning house all at once, but I do actually feel that with a deep practice, we don't give up.
Yes, love this. This is such a wonderful conversation, and I feel like the contribution I have to make to it is dovetailing off of what both of you are saying. Just today, so I taught 2 classes today, so forgive me if my ability to be articulate is a little worn down, but I was just teaching today the history of convict leasing, and we were reading Sarah Haley's book, No Mercy Here, and it's a really rough text, the material history of Black women's experiences under convict leasing, and the ways that those reproductive labors that they were forcibly made to commit to were what created Atlanta, right? Like this, like really the brick and mortar of the city is being touched by the blood, sweat, and tears, right, of these incarcerated women in the late part of the 19th century. And so, I have a classroom of very privileged white and high class students, people who are able to get into the school at Vassar College. And I forgot to mention that the trajectory from going inside and doing writing with women led me to the point where now I'm helping to build the prison studies program at Vassar College in the Africana Studies department, which is really exciting. It's exactly where I need to be in this kind of interdisciplinary space. And because I get to bring my seat, my meditation cushion with me into the classroom, I ask questions like, so what do you notice when you read this material? And the students, what's your somatic response? What do you notice you need? How are you managing your somatic reaction? Do you call people? Do you read it out loud? Do you have to stop? Do you fall asleep? The first response from the students was incredibly intellectual. I read this before, and it connects to now reading it in this context. Like, I was like, okay, that's really good. Now, what about your somatic response? Well, I think because I read it before, I felt bad that it didn't affect me. So we surfaced more empirical responses, somatic responses. And what we start to see is that we are conditioned to shut down in a myriad of ways to this material, not because we don't care, but because we don't have capacity, exactly as you were just saying, right? We don't have capacity to hold that truth because we haven't been taught to. We've been taught this is something that happens to people who are other than us, right? That binary thinking, right? Bad people, sketchy neighborhoods, dangerous relationships for which people are blamed, right? And so we internalize this individual sense of responsibility for societal outcomes in ways that go uninterrupted within our own self-witnessing, right? So what we were surfacing in class today is that people's own self-witnessing is so punitive that they can't even, in a classroom space, articulate without a lot of, caveats, what they were feeling. What did you feel? Now, if we're incarcerating our feelings, our own feelings, what do you think we're doing when we hear testimony from other people's feelings, particularly other people's feelings who are othered by the system of power that we're all being ordered in relationship to? So in order to stay on point, I just want to read a little section of something that I wrote a while ago. When those of us who benefit from proximity to power infantilize, police, and punish what we do not understand in ourselves and each other, we alienate ourselves from our own sense of humanity. There is nothing but truth to be learned from that bearing witness, and that truth is liberatory. I'm going to skip to this, just one more little paragraph. And this is really coming out of the work that is, I feel very fortunate to have found my way into a professional space where I can be all the things that I am simultaneously. So one of the things that came to my awareness through not just Dharma practice, but also academic research, and also just being a preacher's kid and growing up in the church and being Black, is that how we tell time matters. And it matters not just for our understanding of, deadlines or seasons, or is it time to get married or take out the trash, right? But what kind of action is necessary in this moment, right? I think people get caught up on tactics, marching, uprising, looting, petitions, right? But all of those kinds of tactics require a very acute awareness of what time it is. And that means you need to understand the world as it is, right? And this is something that really connects to my own experience in Dharma practice. So keeping time to sit, time to stay, time for the bell or to bow, time to wait for the teacher or to wake up, time keeping against the press of the outside world are all already part of the Dharma practice. There's a blueprint for another pedagogy of freedom to be learned from the stillness of sitting in close proximity to power over time, bearing witness to it, studying it. In retreats from the norms of urgency and productivity, a subversive space is needed and is seated. From daily Dharma practices to the renegade choices of everyday people to stay human, in the words of singer-songwriter Michael Franti, we can choose to prioritize relationship over recognition, freedom over security, collective safety over personal privilege. Along a continuum of radical disruptions of the tyranny of Western time and the press of so-called progress, Dharma folks have been curating ways to pass on to future generations lessons for honoring life and living well before the West was quote unquote won, settled, genocide ensued, right? What we are seeing today with the rise of queer of color practice circles and teachers are people becoming fugitives from the tyranny of Western timekeeping through the transmission of the Dharma in meditation apps and Zoom rooms and the emergence of a future imagination of freedom, a practice of timekeeping born from the love that lives in the contradictions of so-called progress, in the loopholes, I often say, and in the truth of things as they are. And I just wanted to share that little piece because I do think that what I have arrived at in terms of what kinds of freedom are needed have really arisen from my own self-study on the cushion and noticing how carceral my self-talk is, how carceral my imagination of winning and success and security and safety are, how mediocre my ideas of pleasure and freedom and joy and being seen are, because I'm so afraid of letting them be what they want to be. I'm incarcerating my own desires in service to what, right? In service to when. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, the foundation of this country really at its core is piracy. And that theft of land and resources and culture and language continue in carceral logics, in the theft of time, in the theft of community, in the theft of people's humanity and ability to live. We now know how important these delicate intimacies of our social relations are, how much they inform who we are, and what happens when we're severed from them. We've all gotten a little bit of a peek into that through the course of this pandemic. And I don't know about you all, but I am missing my friends, missing my family. And I can't imagine what that kind of alienation does to the 2.6 million people behind bars right now. And I just don't see a way towards healing to circle back that could possibly come out of punishment.
Wow. Thank you all. That was stirring and so much to sit with. I'm definitely feeling my my own somatic response to all of you. It's potent. Thank you.
Oh, this is amazing. Preach on it. This is beautiful. I'm really loving this conversation and the richness. And if I may respond to the what I'm hearing as the medicine of Dharma, as you know, I was at Rikers Island this morning. I'm a chaplain intern there, and I was actually with a fellow classmate. We're both serving as chaplain interns, and we get to the wellness center, which is kind of where we report to on the island, and we put our bags away in the lockers, and before we catch the shuttle to one of the jails, we're at NIC today. And as we're putting away we're not allowed to bring anything into the jail. So I, put my cell phone away. I'm like carrying with me is a pen and a pad of paper. That's all I'm carrying with me. And it was reminiscent of when right before sesshin, a Zen meditation, where there's this kind of terror of like, oh, I don't have anything. I'm giving up everything here for this period of time. And you're plunged. It's this, Bernie Glassman talks about this plunge. And I'm noticing the similarities between going into a session and going into Rikers, into the jail. And I'm struck by the Zen practice, my Dharma practice is allowing me the capacity to be receptive. Once I walk into the facilities, I am receptive to all around me. And that to offer that presence to those who are in prison and to those who are working in the prison I'm learning it's a powerful gift. It's a powerful gift. And so I'm grateful for this practice and seeing the fruits of it in my own work. So, so to continue with our conversation, we're talking about abolition. And, I'm wondering, when we talk about abolition, what do we mean? We talking about what are we abolishing, one, and what do we mean when we say abolition? So if you could speak on that, and I think we're starting with Dr. Vesely-Flad. We'll start with you. Thank you.
Well, like Jasmine, I'm deeply steeped in the work of Angela Davis and her thinking and theories of abolition. So in some ways, you've already set the framework by referring to the 13th Amendment. And, first we want to understand mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex as part of a continuum of racial control, of punitive social control. And so just that acknowledgement. And for those of you who haven't seen the documentary 13th, I think it's required for just having images and so much clarity about what the 13th Amendment has meant for people of African descent in this country. But the other thing to put into our purview or into our frameworks, into our understanding, is this sense that we're not trying to shut down the prison and replace it with something, that there's this corresponding commitment to building up social institutions. And while I'm so indebted to Angela Davis and her thinking, my head right now is actually in James Baldwin, because I'm writing a new book on Baldwin and Audre Lorde, and their teachings as Dharma. And Baldwin is present for me in thinking about how we not only turn towards and grasp what is taking place clearly in our society, the fear that undergirds it. And he had, very intense, complicated ways of understanding this, particularly the ways in which fear is avoided in white supremacist society. There's a kind of repression. There's a kind of mapping onto Black bodies, to Black people broadly, everything that white America does not want to confront. But in then building up these social institutions, these community-based programs that Angela Davis talks about in her book, Are Prisons Obsolete? There's a new way of understanding how we relate to one another. And here's where I actually really want to surface Baldwin, although I would not say this is kind of a classical way of understanding this, but just to say, like, our capacity for joy and for sensuality and our capacity to see each other, to hold each other. It's, I think, not just tearing down the prison. It's not just building up new programs. It's these ways of relating to each other that are really new for this particular culture, although not new in other parts of the world, actually very present, very embedded in daily fabric, in daily life. And, Jasmine, I want to refer to what you said about time and incarcerating your feelings. You had some beautiful language, carceral logics, the delicate intimacies of our social relationships. That's such beautiful language. And just to also surface all of that and say that, have Foucault, I hear Foucault when you say all of this, and, just the sense that we punish ourselves, but how do we emerge from that? And people like Baldwin, people like Audre Lorde, for them, it was deeply embodied. It was deeply liberatory to be in touch with our joy and our sensuality. That is also where I think practice helps us in such deep and intimate ways. So abolition, is this framework. It's this commitment politically, but it's also this new way of being, and being in relationship to ourselves and our energies, our just the way we hold our bodies and attune to ourselves and also to each other. It's much bigger than a social program.
So beautiful, so beautiful. Thank you. Lama Justin, please.
Oh, I also want to go back to Jasmine's point about how we, I kind of feel like I just have to stop. The way we incarcerate ourselves, our emotions, I agree also with Rima's point that this isn't about, closing rikers, building new facilities, coming up with new efficient ways of doing this that are more humane, etc. A wholesale reinvention of what it means to be in relationship. And I guess one thing that hasn't been named that maybe with a little more specificity might be helpful is, in New York City Department of Correction, close to, if not slightly more than half of the people in custody suffer from mental illness and/or substance abuse problems, and I think it's probably about 50%, mental illness, and then substance abuse takes it over, the 50% mark, and then there is, the lack of housing. Even just such basic things as this, that kind of going back to the last question, there needs to be more compassion for one another, and this showing up. Yasmin's point about time. I was reading about this Tibetan, the Bön tradition, that they claim that they're 18,000 years old, and nobody can prove it, but, deep down in their heart and in the heart of their practice, it's 18,000 years back. We need to change the way we think about everything. It frustrates me that the soundbite, especially here in New York City in the past election cycle, and now is crime. Cleaning things up, making it safe, making the subway safe, making, kind of going back to almost like a Giuliani era of, broken windows policing, and as a potential. We are broken. I can't speak. Any expertise I have is New York City based. New York City is broken. As a culture, we're broken. As a society, we're broken. We need to transform our hearts somehow as part of this too. I think the other thing, this past weekend, I was talking with my wife, and there's so much violence in our political system, even in terms of, policy with respect to when executive branches come in, a new executive branch, and they just say, we're doing everything differently now, and the impact that has. I fear that those who are in power don't have the ability to even understand the responsibility that they hold for the harm that they create. And that is especially troubling to me. And I've seen it, internally within Department of Correction, and I've seen people there, really own their responsibility. But when it comes to, how easily decisions can be made that impact thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people and their families and the generational impact. It is just it's mind-boggling that these decisions are even able to be made. That there's that much power that people have to be able to do that. So I agree. The system can't be transformed. It can't be re-envisioned. And this is just so pernicious, to go back to, Wei Shen used that term. This is a pernicious, deeply entrenched cancer, to be frank. And it needs to be treated, healed, loved, etc.
Amen, Lama Justin. Thank you for that. Dr. Syedullah, what do you say?
My goodness. burn it all down. No, I'm just kidding. So the short answer, right, is abolition is the movement, or, you know, transgenerational movements to end our reliance on punitive domination and containment as the premier technology of governance, period. So it is decolonization taken down to the kind of everyday, to the local, to the places we call home. So one of the really helpful tools for thinking about it for me has come from Barnard has done a series of talks on abolition and transformative justice that are incredible and archived. You should go check them out. They're very conversational and approachable, which is really helpful for students. And so they have one called Building Accountable Communities. And they talk about how hard it is to navigate dirty dishes in a household. Now, how many of us have never raised our voices to another person about a dirty dish? I know that when I lived with Reverend Angel, I got yelled at for dirty dishes a lot. And I learned a lot about what it meant to leave no trace and what it meant that I was leaving traces. I got read. Now, I got read and held accountable, but I did not get punished, right? And so one of the things that this, like doing the dishes, kind of innocuous, everyday place of conflict brings up is how punitive we are, like how fast we bring out punitive domination language and canceling each other, right? I'm just gonna do it. Right? You just go, like, we just exclude people in order to have control. These are the tools that we reach for. And it's not just because we're terrible people. It's not because, you know, we didn't get enough sleep. It's lit, or it might be, but it's informed by the climate. This is the air we breathe. It's all about this kind of knee-jerk response, either or, everything or nothing, relationship to power and to agency and mobility. And so, like, imagine a world in which you are co-living with beloveds and a conversation about the dishes didn't end in people storming off or hurt feelings or passive aggressivity or something of this nature, right? What other tools would we need to resource ourselves with in order to sidestep that habituated reaction? Right? The self-righteousness, the indignation, right? This is what I'm thinking about, right? Is that it's not just about tearing things down, it's about learning new skills of accountability and implementing them in like micro ways first, right? Yes. End incarceration now. Yes. End policing now. And if we don't know how to take care of each other, despite the absence of this false sense of security, then we haven't really done the work, right? There is harm happening in our communities constantly that no one gets called the police on for, you know? Intimate violence, child sexual abuse, it goes on and on and on. And so if punishment were a sufficient answer to all of these harms, we would be relying on them. But as my students have reported in their testimonials, people don't feel safe calling the police even when they come from the suburbs and are privileged, because it would destroy their reputation to say my husband is abusive. We don't have protocols for accountability that keep our relationality intact. And we don't do it in ourselves. And so I'm all about the micro to the macro, and really using our own sitting practice as a kind of like mad scientist laboratory and our Sangha spaces as a laboratory for thinking through and iterating on this idea of abolition. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, as a professor of abolition, I'm really clear that it's a praxis, not an ideology, right? It has been moving through change everything, is Ruthie Gilmore, yeah? Abolition isn't about absence, it's about presence, about building life, forming institutions, absolutely. And her new book is coming out this spring, Change Everything. It's about racial capitalism and rethinking carceral imaginations of safety and belonging. And she's been a huge person to help me think about this relationship to space, right? Beginning to think about the space of confinement as these concentric circles that, you know, are the partitions that bind us together. How can we, within the spaces that we call home, cultivate a praxis of accountability that isn't just, we don't have to like reinvent the wheel. These practices are at our backs. Our ancestors have them at the ready. All we have to do is listen. All we have to do is turn around and read what messages they've left behind, the Dharma of the struggle, really. The movement to end slavery, the movement to end lynching, the movement for civil rights against Jim Crow, the movement against mass incarceration and police brutality. These are all iterations of the same instinct to move towards a kind of freedom that free people in this moment cannot even imagine. And this comes from Harriet Jacobs, the person who inspires a lot of my work and scholarship, is the only woman of record to have written her own slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And it was published in 1861, just weeks before the country went to war. And at the end of her narrative, she does get free, but it's not in a way that she would ever have wanted. She, you know, was a fugitive, and she undermined the surveillance of slavery over and over and over, but that's not what afforded her actual political, official, formal freedom. Her freedom was purchased by the woman that she worked for, and that woman actually purchased her freedom along with the freedom of her children. And so she says, reader, my story ends in an unusual way, not with marriage like a Jane Austen narrative, but with freedom. Me and my children are now free. And we're free as the white people of the North, which from my perspective is not saying a great deal, but the conditions of my life are far improved. The dream of my life is not yet realized. This is a paraphrase, right? And so the idea that there is a desire, a dream for freedom, a drive for freedom, a movement towards freedom, that is a kind of freedom that this political system cannot yet defend or define, is important to keep in mind as we think about what it means to be doing this work. It means that we're actually creating the way for something ineffable to arise, because we can't name it quite yet. But we know what is happening right now isn't working and is actually creating more harm. And this comes straight out of Angela Davis's like every speech, right? It's creating more harm than it is creating healing. And so as far as I'm concerned, we are and have been practicing abolition since we've been practicing slavery, colonialism, capitalism, and domination. And so if we've been practicing both for just as long, I have hope that if enough of us keep practicing, something will shift, and something that we don't even know what it is yet will enter the frame.
I'm really energized that as we approach the final, before we go to Q&A, the final portion of this conversation, that we are touching into the the ephemeral, the mysterious, the possibilities of what freedom may be, as we are leaning into this portion of the conversation. But I think it's important. I think so many of you have mentioned that our political system to bring that in juxtaposition with the notion of freedom and talk about fear. I think so much of this current election is a fear for public safety, is a fear of witnessing gun violence going up. It's a fear of, including in Black and Latinx communities, the fear of the increase in violence amongst one another requires what we know as, many ways, just not too long ago have had a national outpouring to fight the violence of state violence. So, and even in San Francisco, with their public defender, Chesa Boudin, is trying to shift the conversation around he's now, I believe, the district attorney of San Francisco is trying to shift the paradigm within the legal system and is getting all sorts of public pushback because there's this collective fear for public safety. So I'm curious if maybe we'll start with Dr. Vesely-Flad around how do we meet this fear, this collective fear for our own bodies and for our own sense of safety, and where does the Dharma or other practices of liberation come in to meet that fear?
I'll just be very personal when I say I think all Dharma practice is working with fear, at least in my own life. Just to be very transparent, it's turning towards aversion. I actually was writing on this very topic today. And so it's just being very clear about what comes up when I don't feel safe, which is in many, many, many environments. But also to just be conscious of not projecting, right? And to see the bigger dynamic and the compassion that Lama Justin referred to in an earlier part of our conversation, I think is so important in terms of understanding what people are struggling with. And then that kind of avoidant energy, which is, again, what Jasmine was talking about, how we are habituated, a kind of visceral reaction sometimes, to turn towards that and to be more conscious of our reactions than, you could say, the target or the object of our reactions. And I'll just say, because this was at the very beginning of our conversation, that parenting is such a teaching practice in the sense that, like with our own impulses and bodies, it's easy to be punitive in a knee-jerk way. And I recently read this book by a trauma specialist who, it's actually a book on ADHD. I have a child with ADHD. And one of the things he cautions again and again is to turn towards our own responses as parents and not just to look at the behavior of our children. In so many of the public talks I give, I'm thinking of, like places like Harvard or what have you. I'm talking about parenting, not about incarceration, but it's because the lessons and the practices are so relevant, which is that if we can work with our own impulses and now I extend this to, as in the example you gave, the people of San Francisco who are having such aversion, to look at the broader society that is created and perpetuated, and to focus on that, and not only the knee-jerk aversion that arises when we feel afraid, or when there are actions we find abhorrent, or we have aversion to in some way. So it's, I think, very complicated. And again, as a parent, I think it's also very complicated. We are in this role to protect. I think it's nuanced, but to be thoughtful and attuned, as opposed to habituated and simply operating out of our own conditioning, I think is so central to how we approach these very complicated questions of public safety.
Thank you so much. Mom Justin, thoughts about fear and parenting and incarceration?
Yes, I'm a parent as well, so I definitely can connect with what Rima was saying, and I was just taking notes on everything that she was saying, and I mean I'm left with owning responses, understanding our impulses. And then I wrote, trusting into, this is almost like a meaningless statement sometimes, trusting into our shared basic goodness. Like what does that mean? So whether or not it's San Francisco or New York City or any community, as we're trying to figure this out. And I think that, the Buddhist tradition offers us this concept of Buddha nature, that all of us, right, we share this fundamental similitude, and the fundamental similitude is that all of us are, we all have within us, and it's not like deep down. It's very just it's right under the surface, if not on the surface, of our fundamental awakening. Our basic goodness, our infinite capabilities. And I think that there needs to be a way for cities, societies, our culture in general, to look at how it is that we can interrogate our impulses, the automatic knee-jerk reactions, shed light on these irrational projections that I believe it was Jasmine brought up about all of the projections of white fear, white anxiety, white loss of power, loss of voice, all of these things onto Black and brown bodies, and the subsequent violence that almost constantly ensues after that, or as a result of that. I am an optimist, and I don't know why, but I think that we have this. The Buddhist tradition offers such a beautiful reflection back towards each one of us, and it is a waste to not somehow engage this. But it is also, to be totally frank, a mystery as to how we will, when our political system kind of refers us back to, out of fear, you and your kids should be safe. We don't have what the community needs. When threatened, we all kind of fall into a reactivity that is irrational and tends to lead to harm. And we need to somehow move past this. There has to be a deep commitment to moving past almost as if we find in the Zen tradition, these vows to move into that which is impossible and go against the stream, of our kind of samsaric habitual reactivity towards being able to understand basic goodness in each one of us, thereby leading us to an alternative. Because again, election cycle after election cycle after election cycle, it's kind of a no-brainer. Just bring up fear and everybody will react.
Thank you, Lama Justin. Dr. Syedullah, please.
All right, so we have compassion versus punishment and fear-based parenting, basic goodness, and some really incredible offerings here about how we access that collectively and what that possible future could look like. And what both Rima and Mama Justin are guiding my thoughts towards is interconnectivity and how we can create a relationship to addressing fear that centers our interconnectivity rather than our oppositionality, which is largely socially constructed rather than endemic or indigenous to the way that we encounter harm and each other. One of the big concepts for me that comes out of the work of abolitionist organizing is moving beyond the binary, as Lama Justin was mentioning, of perpetrator and victim, to consider how, out of what context and conditions of culpability this harm and cycle of violence was created, right? So one of the big questions that happens in every Q&A about abolition is, what about the murderers and rapists? There's a lot of standard responses within the movement to this question. But what comes to me in the context of this conversation is, what about the culture of culpability that creates murderers and rapists? Mm-hmm. They don't just come out of a vacuum. They're not just evil. Even though if you watch enough serial cop shows, you might come to think that that's true, and that there are serial killers around every corner. But, other than not watching television and maybe like not watching the news all the time, I think the biggest way to really manage our fear is to think interconnectively, right? So this is also coming out of pandemic knowledge, right? Like, my safety, my ability to stay safe from the virus is dependent on my being in brutal, honest conversation with those who are closest to me. Now, how hard is that? One would think it's easy, but it is in fact quite challenging. Who has encountered like a little bit of shame about being like, well, I might not be able to hang out with you because this one person, maybe I've been exposed, but maybe not. And the ambiguity alone, right, causes us to kind of be like, it'll be okay. Or like, maybe I don't really need to wear a mask. Or, I mean, I don't know about you all, but I'm very, very cautious, but not everybody is. And so also being in full disclosure about, I'm very, very cautious because I have pre-existing yada yada that make me vulnerable in these kinds of ways, right? We're not used to disclosing all of that kind of information just to keep ourselves safe, and certainly not holding all of that information in order to keep each other safe. And yet it's become incumbent upon us to do so, to learn that skill. And so in a similar way, particularly when we're thinking about mental illness, I've been really excited in disability justice. I've been really excited about the ways that we are naming our mental health divergences, like the ways that we aren't all neurotypical. And in fact, the more people articulate their neurodiversity, the less normalcy seems, right? And so I just believe that as we move into more honesty about what it is we're holding, what it is we're working with, in terms of trauma, in terms of history, in terms of bias, telling the truth about how we are racialized. That's the work that we do in radical Dharma spaces, is really telling the truth about our relationships to racialization so that we can stop scripting, right? Stop relying on the scripts of anti-racist, nonviolent communication that actually bypass our embodied experiences, our lived experiences of shame, of violence, of harm, of bystanderness, of witnessing and wishing we could have done otherwise, but feeling that clench in our throat, right? Of what could happen if we break protocol. Okay, so interconnectivity. But then, and I usually, go hard on healing justice and listening to ourselves and listening to each other. I have a new teacher who is pushing me to think really hard about self-defense, because there are communities that are being rendered increasingly vulnerable by the conditions that we're seeing unfold in our world today. And all of the transformative justice that we have at our disposal is not going to be sufficient to defend the lives of those most vulnerable. I'm thinking of Black trans women. I'm thinking about undocumented people. I'm thinking about people who are unhoused. I'm thinking about people who don't have health care. Like, these are the folks who we need to think about defending, and we need to be afraid for, right? I think a lot of our kind of individuated relationship to fear and self-preservation means that we don't see our survival as bound up in those who are most vulnerable, those who are in the context of prison abolition organizing through the organization of critical resistance. The language in the mission statement is those most vulnerable, right? Like those most directly impacted by the prison industrial complex. How do we align ourselves with those most directly impacted such that we understand what they are fearing? We know what their 911, we have an emergency is, and we begin collaborating with them to pool resources to think about what protection could look like. I live in the Hudson Valley, Lenape, Mohican, Wappingers lands near the Hudson River. And I know that the people around me, it's like blue, half red territory, a microcosm, the macrocosm. And I know everyone, every household around me that many of the households around me are heavily armed. And when Trump was in office, I was really scared of what could happen. There were marches, there were caravans of Trump supporters going down my street. My parents live nearby. We were talking about getting walkie-talkies to stay in communication. I think we need to be thinking really strategically from a place of compassion and hope about what we do when the state can't protect us. And how do we use the tools of mindfulness and patience and stillness to know what time it is and know what community accountability looks like in instances of emergency, of collective emergency. And so those are the things that Joy James has been pushing me hard to think about, is what does your Dharma have to say about self-defense, and particularly the protection of those who are most directly impacted by the prison industrial complex? So I offer that to you all to consider as well.
Thank you, Dr. Syedullah, and thank you, everyone. And now we have around 15, 18 minutes, I believe, and I want to invite Peace to come back to share some of the questions you all are watching in the what to me is a mysterious space, but I invite some questions and comments, and so for our esteemed guests, so we can continue the conversation for about 15 more minutes.
Yes, thank you. I'll just sprinkle in a few things that anyone wishes to comment on. Yeah, that's been so rich. It's been so rich. So there have been a few questions of invitation to speak more about the economic system. Here, there's a question that's pointing to socialist prisons in Norway. And in the chat, there have been questions about commenting on the economic system. And then, yeah, I think a little separately than that, as a few of you are pointing to, there are questions around concrete political actions that might be done today. So I'll just leave those there for you to respond to.
So what about capitalism, and what about everyday ways to get involved? Were those the questions? I'll just riff really quickly. I think that the fact that this whole history really unfolds from the commodification of human life means that our relationship to property and our relationship to labor is soaked in an extractive, dehumanizing, sadomasochistic relationship to greed and hoarding and wealth and piracy. So the economic system that we call free is untenable for most of us. And I was really excited in that moment of organizing that happened around the financial crisis of Occupy, because there was a contemplative approach to that protest that was so powerful because it was collective, right? Bourgeois property professionals were literally housing themselves in public space alongside unhoused, unemployed, undocumented people. Now, what does that kind of Sangha look like? So that's both practical everyday ways that we could do something different. And it's also, I mean, it's hard, right? You can't start a movement on our own. But I think that, you know, as somebody who benefits from academic elitism and the hoarding of knowledge and weaponizing of it in order to protect our country, and very clear that I am entrenched and implicated in a system of violence just by my profession. And so the way I try to have a little bit of an integrity in that is to understand my relationship to power as infiltration. And I'm here to smuggle in as much knowledge from the margins, I call them profits from the margins, as I can, right? So inviting activists who have been doing work against gentrification, the poverty scholars in San Francisco and the Bay Area, to teach classes and to get paid to teach the whole campus about what it means to put the knowledge that's produced on the edges of society at the highest realm of expertise in an academic institution of elite, predominantly white patronage. That's the beginning for me. So I think it's about looking at what relationship to power you have and how you can I don't want to be too romantic, right? But how you can work within that space of proximity to power and bring something else to the table. Introduce a new conversation, break script, be truant, cut school, like break the rules in ways that allow something new to enter the room, like humanity, like feelings, like, integrity. 2 cents.
I am not totally sure I understand the question, but on the note of capitalism, I think one aspect that we have not touched upon, but I think is so critical to just hold in front of us, and again with this spirit or this energy of compassion, is how impoverished communities are played off against one another. And many volumes have been written on where prisons get built and why they get built in certain areas. And even just in New York State, the wholesale removal of people from New York City communities to upstate communities in order to provide jobs. 2 whole legislative districts have been removed. And so the state has gradually started to close prisons, but it's still just incredible. And so it's, I think, important for us to wrap our heads around that capitalist enterprise of human collateral, essentially. The ways in which bodies are removed from families, from their livelihoods, and then counted as members of political districts in these rural communities that are losing their own bodies. And so, just to have a very nuanced understanding of how entrenched it is. And when I used that term magnitude earlier in our conversation, that's a big part of it. I mean, there are many people who are deeply invested in maintaining the prison industrial complex because they're trying to feed their children, because they are trying to survive because of their livelihoods. And so to take into account the complexity of that and to have a nuanced and sensitive approach to addressing that, as much as we still do not buy into those terms and advocate to shut down these systems and implement something or institutionalize something new. But this conversation about capitalism, I mean, it's so complex. I don't even know exactly where to begin, as much as that is what came to mind. And again, just both addressing what's taking place, but also not buying into the terms on which that conversation is taking place. I think both are really important. There was a question about activism. I'm not totally sure. But I appreciate, Jasmine, what you said about Occupy. And, it's 10 years old now. The movement is 10 years old. And I think maybe it is shifting in this era of COVID. I'm not totally sure. So much is shifting in this era of COVID. I think it will be important for us to direct as much as possible what can emerge. And in that vein, here is where I do feel a sense of ungroundedness, which is maybe an interesting word, but I think housing is something that we, name. I mean, what you have said, what many of, I think Lama Justin, you also have mentioned what it means to be unhoused, but just the sheer cost of housing, to buy, to rent, the way rents are going up, just all of that, and the level of trauma that is causing for people. I think that reverberates just as directly into this widespread penal system. And how to enter into that, I'm not totally sure, but it is important to attune to it.
Yeah, and in New York City, the exact number I'm not really 100% sure of, but it's between $450,000 per year to $500,000 per year to keep one person in New York City Department of Correction, in the custody of New York City Department of Correction. And when people see the state of the buildings, see the quality of the food, see the quality of the services, it is unconscionable, right? Like how that much money, I mean, you could theoretically probably, that's more money than paying for an Ivy League education, probably straight through like a PhD, for each individual. And there are so many people who make good money in corrections. The capital. Yeah, you can't remove the economics out of from this problem, and I've seen that. And what I've also seen though is that people in city government are terrified of being held accountable and count on people not showing up and holding them to account. And this is one very basic way that the heat can be put on, local, especially within, local criminal justice systems, city council. The one thing I did come out of with a deep respect for working, for New York City was that there is power in the political system. And it's funny also because I think most Buddhists kind of think of themselves naturally as outsiders and will take an outsider position. But there's a lot to be said about claiming that power and working it. And, we see this in other, activist movements where people will come up and claim power and change the standing of those people that they're trying to represent. And it's not fully the answer because I think the system is and Yasmin's comment about nobody is innocent or nobody is not clean in this system. As long as we can own that and show up and say I'm here to fight, I'm here to change this, whether it be holding people accountable at Board of Correction hearings or with the State Commission on Corrections, or going up to Albany, or going to City Hall, or holding Mayor Adams accountable, or occupying the intersection right in front of the bridge, to Rikers Island, and just owning that. I very much agree with Yasmin's point about the power of the Occupy movement being that it is motivated by a contemplative yearning for larger change. And I think this is the thing that needs to be honed, is the contemplative basis for the disruption of these kinds of systems. And it's not just necessarily, Buddhist in nature, it's every faith tradition coming together and doing this, and secular humanist, aspect too, like where this is about us as human beings learning how to treat other human beings with dignity and respect, and confronting biases, confronting, these illusory narratives that have been spun. And so it's not, I don't think it's, this and or that, for those who can work the system, for those who can become lawyers and work the system, do that. For those who want to become politicians, go do that, and then for those who want to occupy the roads, sidewalks, for those who work in academia, and this is collective. And I think this kind of comes back to the larger point that everybody here has said, is our interconnected responsibility of showing up for one another. So it's not just one group or one person or one role, it's how we're all going to come together if we really want to change this. And that net, the like Indra's net of disruption, perhaps, is the thing that we need to reclaim, and I think that capitalism is weird, right? Like people in power respect power, and people in power are afraid of people who claim power. And I think there's just a lot of work to be done in claiming power.
Wow. The image of the Indra's net of disruption. Really, that's really sitting with me, or I'm sitting with that. And I feel like that might be the note in our conversation today. I knew it was going to be dynamic, and I felt like this was illuminating and revolutionary and full of mysteries and possibilities. And so I just want to give a deep bow of gratitude to our esteemed guests, Lama Justin von Bujdoss, Dr. Jasmine Syedullah, Dr. Rima Vesely-Flad, for sharing your tremendously insightful perspectives and your courageous and compassionate expressions of the Dharma and abolition clearly in your life and your work. I feel it so much, even through Zoom. I feel the potency and the power of that. And I also want to wish to thank our colleagues at Union Theological Seminary, Reverend Kosen Gregory Snyder, Peace Twesigye, Ian Reese, and our wonderful ASL interpreters, Sarika Mehta and Travis Wynn, for making this evening possible, truly. Thank you all so much.